Renee Mental, Director and President. Thank you all for joining us this evening for Our Fair City in Between, which is the third and final event in our series, Our Fair City, Building a More Equitable New York, moderated by Justin Davidson and co-presented with CURB. Throughout the program in the series, Justin has explored how we might rethink and rebuild our city's built environment from the skyline to the street with an amazing group of committed New Yorkers. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by three experts to discuss how we can rethink NYC's streetscape. Urban designer Justin Garrett Moore, landscape architect Kate Orff, and transportation expert Shin-pei Tsay. Although this is the final event in this series, we invite you to check out our website for more virtual programming at mcny.org. I'll welcome our speakers to the screen in just a moment, but before we get started, I want to thank all of you who've contributed to this event tonight. We truly appreciate your support, particularly right now as we navigate this challenging time. So also, please note, tonight we will be taking questions throughout the program via the question function, but we will not be using the hand-raising function or the chat function. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. If you're watching on Zoom, the closed captioning is also available for tonight's program. So you can enable that at the bottom of your screen. Now, I would like to introduce the moderator, Justin Davidson, who will in turn introduce our distinguished guest. Justin Davidson has been the classical music and architecture critic at New York Magazine since 2007. He is now the editor of Cityscape as part of Curbed and New York Magazine. He won a Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2002 and an American Society of Newspapers Editors Criticism Award. He has contributed to The New Yorker, W, Travel and Leisure, The Los Angeles Times, Slate, and Salon, and has appeared on WNYC and NPR. He's also the author of the fantastic book in 2017, Magnetic City, A Walking Companion to New York. So now I'll turn it over to Justin.
Thank you, Whitney. And I'm delighted to be back for the third and final episode in our series, Our Fair City. Fair in the sense both of beautiful and just. And this series grew out of an article I wrote back in the fall looking at the fact that this is kind of an inflection point for New York, not just because of the racial and social justice issues that have been circulating and because of the pandemic and the prospective recovery from the pandemic and the economic storm we're all facing, but also because this is a moment of real change in leadership in the city of New York. As you probably know by now, we're in the middle of a campaign for the next mayor. I think we're up to 30 odd candidates. And also much of city council will be turning over thanks to term limits. So I wanted to take this moment to reflect on the notion that all of these things taken together have the capacity, the opportunity to change really a lot, everything about the way New York works, the way New York functions from work to home and in between. So our first panel was about home, the second one was about work, and now we're in between, by which we mean the public realm, public space. We have a crackerjack panel, and usually we try to make sure that these panels are have adequate representation from different groups. Unfortunately, this time, fully half the panel is named Justin, so we will try to make sure that doesn't happen again. Justin Garrett Moore is now the program officer, Humanities in Place at the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and hopefully he will explain what that job means, but he was previously the executive director of the Public Design Commission. So one of the people through whom all designs having to do with the public realm in New York flowed. Kate Orff is a landscape designer, the founding principal of Scape Design, and she works both at the scale of urban plazas, relatively small little pocket parks, sometimes found in front of buildings, but also on a massive scale of coastal resilience and even out into the water and below the water. Some of her projects are actually literally not visible from above the waterline. But really as I'm sure she'll get into, talking about how urban landscapes can adapt to climate change at the coasts. Shin-pei Tsay's experience, she's got a long resume, which I will let you look at on the website of this evening. But she is currently Director of Policy for Cities and Transportation at Uber, and has a long history of working on the intersection of public space and transportation, especially in New York, even though today she joins us from San Francisco. So panelists, if you would turn your cameras on, we can all be on the stage at once, and your mics also. And, well, there's Shin-pei. Okay, great. So we'll just sort of do a quick round of introductory presentations, starting with Justin, and then we'll jump into questions. And just to remind you, if you're just joining us, there's a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Send me questions, and we will try to work in as many as we possibly can. Go ahead, Justin, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Justin. So for my sort of introduction, I really appreciated this prompt of in between. And this is an image from one of the many Black Lives Matter murals that was installed across the US, but a version here in New York City down at Center Street, and talking about our public realm and our public spaces being really at an intersection of a lot of different conversations about being in between, right? So this particular site may be in between the people and the kind of the civic heart of the city, right? Between people and power, and sort of deciding what becomes of our space and how it's used and who has access to it and the ability to shape it. This image is also of interest for those that know New York City. It's also sort of an important site that is in between different periods of time, different eras, right? Between our past and our future. So while the activists with Black Lives Matter chose to sort of mark this space, in the past, this was once a space that was outside of the city and a site for burial of people from African descent. And so this conversation about what we do with our public realm is something that I think we have to take seriously. The moment that we're in, kind of acknowledging what we saw over the summer with, of course, the pandemic, and really thinking about how we use this opportunity to make a better and more inclusive and just future. Next slide. And so another sort of in-between prompt that I think is important is to talk about how we even make these decisions about what happens to our public spaces. This is an effort that the Public Design Commission, along with the Fine Arts Federation of New York, did in terms of having a conversation about how our streets were going to be changing and thinking about what that process looks like, how decisions would be made differently than they may have been done in the past. Sort of what's our alternative or antidote to, let's say, someone like Robert Moses. So just a few kind of prompts from this: be more transparent, understand lives and impact to a neighborhood, build trust, and focus on equity. And so these kinds of conversations are a different kind of in-between, in that they're looking at different stakeholders, who's affected, who's impacted, and even different types of solutions, working between disciplines, for example, as a prompt for our work. And in this case, the conversation was even working between the public sector, people in the civic sector, and private. Next slide. And so, this is a big part of our work, and I wanted to include, a couple images that were positive, or hopefully will be seen as positive, and giving a little hope that we can do it. Very often we sort of get caught in our sort of challenges and difficulties, but this is one type of an example from Queens. I use two Queens examples of the sort of the can-do attitude. This is a project called Hunters Point South that looks at our public realm in a very comprehensive way. This was a project led by EDC and the Housing Preservation and Development agencies that included things that weren't necessarily only economic development or only housing. I think there was a comprehensive conversation about the importance and the need for public spaces. So here we see an esplanade in Hunters Point South Park. And next slide. That has already sort of been able to serve as a place for health during this challenging time and pandemic, and forming a different type of sustainability and resiliency. But this is also an image of Center Boulevard, and this is one of my kind of personal points of pride is during the planning and design process, I literally forced a lot of people to make this space, right, to do this street in a different way that centers things like alternative mobility with wonderful bicycle lane, but also the network of bioswales that come throughout the park that were otherwise planned and considered to be in some form of waste, but we all learned recently that it was not, and that the center of our streets can be something different. Next slide. And then my other Queens example is, this is 34th Avenue in Jackson Heights, which was one of the many sort of open streets during the summer and really continuing that we can use our existing fabric and think in maybe light touch ways for how we reimagine how we use our public realm and public space in between all the different facets and aspects of life, but also being mindful that our existing fabric, our existing communities, and a diversity of people and populations are important to be a part of this work. Next. And I'll end with, I'm still a bureaucrat at heart. This is the organization chart for the city of New York. I really encourage everyone to look it up. The people are up at the top, and all, the mayor, all the different sort of elected officials that people think of, but all these little boxes are all the different agencies and departments that are determining and shaping what happens with our everyday lives, between our work and home, between school and care for our elderly, our parks, our services. All of this is sort of embodied in this. And I think we need to do a better job of working between all these different components of our work. Next. And sort of a provocation that I like to give is that, we have our structures and many of them are there for good reasons, but maybe in this time we need new structures and new ways of thinking, not sort of in the silos and in the kind of the hierarchies of power, but maybe to think more across for what is really needed in our public realm and public spaces, and work between one another. And so I always have this prompt of what about the Department of Care that maybe works more laterally, working across agencies like education, like health, like environmental protection, to care for our spaces and to care for one another. So that's my sort of prompt for the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Justin. Shin-pei, you want to follow up?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here, and thank you to the museum for having me and hosting these conversations. That was a great setup, Justin, both Justins, but that last bit, I think I'm going to maybe set up a little bit more context for how we think about the transportation side of things and that tension between needing to move people and provide access to opportunities and amenities and those things, as well as transportation being the mechanism of creating place. And there is this inherent tension in that, but also great opportunity. And I'm currently a director of policy for cities at Uber, but really spent the majority of my experiences, I think of my experiences as really trying to examine the systemic reasons behind the kind of public realm we have, and then the ways that can be changed. And this, I just have a series of images to kind of speak to in the background. This cover image is, emblematic of New York, right? The city of walking. But in reality, and in maybe even in practice, and what's upheld in courts, is that this space where all these people are taking, the in-between space, is not their space. There are all these people in this space, but it's not actually theirs. And that's the intersection of transportation and the public realm. And so, 50 years ago, the reason we have this kind of tension is we've embarked on this 50-year project, the interstate highway system. We're long overdue for an overhaul of that system. And over those years, I'm sure people here are very familiar, but it's just worth reminding ourselves just how entrenched this is. Private car use was prioritized over everything else: trains, buses, streetcars, walking, biking. And though the economy did grow, and that was really a driving force behind it, and cities expanded and more people moved to cities, our public realm very much diminished during that time. And we can no longer sit for a moment. If you go to the next slide, I think there's an old picture of Park Avenue where you once were able to sit. And that was what avenues actually used to be. The places to sit. They were thoroughfares for sure. You see the pedestrian path, there are places to go, but you were also allowed to sit, and it was a place. But just imagine, as these practices grew, these kinds of places were eroded over time by the way that funding is provided. Engineering practices were entrenched, even design manuals. And you can see a lot of the work over the last 10 years are trying to nibble, to restore some of the practices and bring back, the great diagram that Justin shared is some of that, bring back some thinking about centering people in the midst of these kinds of places. And it sounds simplistic a little bit, but there's also larger forces that beyond the city. There's cheap gas, cheap parking, cheap land. That it's all bolstered by cheap driving, and cities kept expanding. And this happened in big places and small places. And just to, if you go to the next slide, this was something that I was starting to really look into. What sorts of neighborhoods were erased for this massive project through the funding structures, through the design practices. Neighborhoods like this is my hometown, Syracuse. There was a neighborhood that was completely demolished to build an interstate highway, especially this on-ramp, this big on-ramp to accelerate the speeds and be able to drive through the city. And I'm not calling for nostalgia in this case, but more of these are people with neighborhoods. There were businesses here. And in particular, this was a racist decision made because it was a Black neighborhood. And that's something that we should be thinking about as we think about equity. And as we start to think about, recovery and what can we think about our future, and that was the provocation I was really working with here, is like, how should we start orienting ourselves with this transition, new leadership? We have to do a lot to right these wrongs, but also think about these as ways of getting ourselves back on a different track. And, we have to, one of the things I think about is transit operations and how that was always the backbone. We always have to think about that system level. You go to the next slide. These are just background images, but we also have to think about shorter trips, encouraging people to walk and bike and enjoy all those trips under a mile. We have to think across the system as much as we think down to the detail, and we have to keep on trying to take space back. And I think the major kind of impetus for me when I think about these questions is the urgency. We have 10 years to meet a climate change goal. How do we adapt to extreme weather and decarbonize? And we have to think equally about planning for people who have historically been left out. People should not wait for the ideal transportation mode that fits the need of transportation planners. We should be thinking about what people need today. We should be focusing on expanding network in lower income neighborhoods, bring that connectivity, thinking about transit investments to bring people to essential jobs, not just good jobs in the financial district. We don't want people to, we want people to not think it's okay to have 3 transfers and a mile to the bus stop. Like, we really should be thinking about providing them options that get them where they need to go. And if you go to the next slide, if we can do all these things together, we will have that vibrancy. in neighborhoods outside of the Manhattan core, throughout the city, and a vibrancy that reflects what people want to do. If we can use what people want to do as assets in designing the services for moving them, we will have great places. And so I'll just leave it at that for now, but thank you for having me.
Okay, so we've covered a little bit of public plazas, a little bit of transportation and streets. And Kate, are you going to take us to parks?
Yeah, so thank you for that, both. And I guess I just really also appreciate the discussion around our fair city and how you described it as beautiful and just. I mean, I really do feel like, just on a very personal note, that that our city is hurting, and just seeing the closed storefronts and unemployment, all these vibrant restaurants, and a lot of really what was it and has been part of New York's magic is feeling incredibly stressed. So I say that on like an emotional level, and as somebody who loves the city, and also with this Justin's frame of care, which is like, I think we all just deeply care about the city, and it's really a time now with a new federal administration and potentially a new mayoral administration to really double down and dig in and get New York into a new place, right, in a place that is more just. So I sort of just organized some slides around the idea of scales of landscape. And so I thought to start with this smaller project by Scape, which is the Greenpoint Library and Environmental Education Center in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. It's, first of all, I think a project that is special and unique because it is a library. And I do feel like, as Eric Kleinenberg has written in his book, Palaces for the People, that these neighborhood libraries are incredible lifelines. They're incredibly provide places to gather. It's sort of a hallmark of a decent city to have open, friendly, welcoming libraries. And so we've done a lot of libraries, and I'm really, really proud of this one because it just sort of fits into Greenpoint so beautifully. The design of the library is also something that is attempting to kind of magnify or make a stronger relationship between people and the sort of immediate geology of New York. So this kind of striated stone is a sort of testament to the glaciation that occurs, and the sort of variation of the stone kind of harkens back to our geological history. Next, but you can see it's a very, I would just say modest, if you will, but very carefully and thoughtfully designed space that really tries to pull people in from the immediate environment and create a gathering space on its exterior, while the interior is, of course, also lively and welcoming. And interestingly, this was a project that was in part funded by a lawsuit from a previous generation around ExxonMobil and the spills in Newtown Creek. Another kind of interesting personal story is my dad grew up in this area. My great-grandparents lived on Monitor Street. I mean, this is sort of a Greenpoint emerged from this former urban context. And so it's a nice sort of gesture just to think about the city constantly renewing itself and pushing into this next era without losing the scale and the kind of qualities that it always had. Next. So this is a sort of a zoomed out view of the architect is Marble Fairbanks. And so you can kind of see, obviously it's not the actual ice sheet moving through, but the sort of grain of the ice sheet and the multi-level kind of gathering spaces. So in terms of a basic idea of scales of landscape, I think New York has done really well and is getting better at this kind of pocket park scale. We're also known for our kind of municipal parks in the form of Central Park and Prospect Park, et cetera. But I do feel like there are scales that are missing in our urban landscape that I think have been, the need for these different scales of thinking has been magnified by the COVID crisis and the COVID pandemic and our economic straits. So let's go to the next slide. So, one of the things that I am particularly interested in, and if we talk about our fair city and a just city, is, thinking bigger around how to begin to connect the landscapes that we do have. So much of our urban fabric, and this is Queens. I'm in Queens right now, so I have a particular love for this borough. My dad, again, was born here, and I'm living here for 20 years. So, I do feel like this is the next level for New York to begin to knit together these very, very disparate patches of exciting parks, but that parks that have been kind of truly carved up by massive highways, of which Shin-pei just described, right? That same, maybe not the same era, but there was a certain moment when there was a preference for wide cars, preference for cars and very wide superhighways. So even though this map, thinks that it could be connected, the idea of stitching together and making landscapes that are more connective and open, and that sort of take on systemic injustice by providing a fabric and an infrastructure that can kind of hold people and move people through the city, no matter what their means, is to me something that I think we need to focus on in the future. Next. And so this is just a view, I would say I've experienced this firsthand where, again, we pride ourselves on our park network. And of course it is, or our parks rather, and it is one of the greatest cities of parks in the world. However, it's not really a park network. But we do have robust and vigorous highways. These are all highways that pretty much are surrounding me right now. That most people on this call are probably familiar with. But all of these tend to separate us and carve up our urban landscape. And so they're there, but I do feel like if you talk about the in-between, this is the in-between for me. Like it is literally, I feel like in between neighborhoods, it's in between connecting park spaces, it's in between in terms of not being sort of accommodating for older people, younger children, et cetera. So I think we need to take on some of these, some of this in the next decades to come. Next. And then, moreover, when you talk about landscape and the decent city or our fair city, I also feel like there is a public health issue, and this goes again to Justin's kind of cutting across silos, that we think about our parks and these, and the left side of this image, these sort of patches, but on the right side of the image is urban heat island effect. And I think we're learning more and more in the era of, increased temperatures, that this sort of urban heat island disproportionately affects communities of color and the elderly and children. So if you go to the next slide, we sort of began to develop this tool, and where we're starting to now sort of match tree cover and canopy with sort of these hot spots. So although Justin, I would love to talk about our coastal work and the need for an interconnected waterfront, I'll leave it here as a provocation for this our fair city. Thanks.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. That was a great whirlwind overview of some of the issues that we face. And one of the things that really strikes me is the way all these different aspects of the public realm and moving from one place to another at different speeds and at different scales really intertwine. I don't know if we can get Shin-pei's second slide back, the black and white one of Park Avenue, because that really, I've seen that, I love that slide, and it really strikes me. Yeah, there it is. Because one of the things about this is that it is part of a massive urban transportation revolution, right? Because underneath that median is the electrified rails going into Grand Central. And the reason Park Avenue exists is because Grand Central, in the building of the Grand Central Terminal, that the rails were decked over, and what was created was this park-like median, the two roadways on either side. There's only, I think, one lane, and this was taken at, correct me if I'm wrong, Shin-pei, I think in the 20s,
I think so.
Before, among other things, there was overnight parking in New York City because that started in 1950. So there's no parking lane. And then the buildings on either side of those are part of, maybe not this far up, but a little bit farther down, are part of Terminal City, which was the real estate project that effectively funded all of that transit infrastructure. So park, road, rail, and commercial buildings were all intertwined. And I think what we're looking for is a way to do all of that kind of complexity now in a way that also brings in a sort of consciousness of social justice. And Shin-pei, let's stay with you for a moment. I know you have worn many different hats. Before the pandemic, there was a lot of conversation about Uber's presence in New York and in other cities and what it was doing to public space and to transportation. It was blamed for, among other things, creating a lot of the traffic it was originally hoping to alleviate. What is the role of car share going forward, do you think, in a dense city, and especially one where we might hopefully be looking at congestion pricing being part of the next round of actually being implemented in New York?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when I look at the numbers overall, ride hail continues to be such a small percentage of the kinds of trips that
we can get rid of this slide now, I think.
Ride hail is such a small percentage of overall trips, and fundamentally, what will never change about big cities is a transit system that will never go away. Ride hail is such a small part of all the trips that people like to take. Even if Uber doubled its business in big cities, it would still be less than 3% of all the trips generally. So what's occurring though, in terms of kind of the criticisms around, let's say, congestion or increased miles traveled in a car, is that on-demand aspect. And I think the way I think about it is, Uber success grew as transit, as the population in New York City grew, right? It was like 2015, 2016, 2017. And transit was really starting to struggle. It was starting, the trains were starting to get crowded. There were many more delays. There was challenges in keeping up with operations. They're separate forces, but I think it reinforced the adoption to a certain degree. But I don't believe that ride hail will ever replace transit. Transit has to be in place. And what we can expect though is that capacity of that technology to provide on demand, to do efficient routing, to meet, let's say, increased access, particularly outside of Manhattan, is something that the city can benefit from. And I'm not even really wearing my Uber hat right now. I'm just talking about that kind of capacity. So it doesn't need to be Uber cars, but let's say there are microtransit vehicles, or there's wheelchair accessible vehicles, or there's a service just for cars with kid seats, because that's always a huge issue with when you start to have a family. But there are all these needs, right? How about the seniors trying to get to doctors, and having that part of the way that you provide care is that you order them a way to get to the appointment. And I think there's that on-demand capacity and the shared capacity, the higher utilization of each vehicle can help contribute. But again, I think we really have to put our funding and our effort on public transit and make that reliable, frequent, and accessible across the entire city, first and foremost.
So Justin, hearing this, and I'm thinking about, we're gonna, the city is in the process of developing a shared e-scooter system, supposed to debut sometime in the spring to complement all the bikes. City Bike, as I noticed, has put in a couple of stations at vaccination centers, because leveraging its ability to be flexible. During the pandemic, there's been a rise in biking, but there's also, all different kinds of micro mobility, whether it's hoverboards or electrified scooters or, um, uh, different kinds of things. But also there's a lot of pressure to put in new busways like we have on 14th Street to extend the bus network. So can you just talk a little bit about the pressures, all of these changes in the ways that we want to be able to use the streets and to get around are going to place on that limited acreage, and how you design for that?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. And at the PDC, we have a great technical term for it. It's stuff on the street. That there, as you mentioned, there's this sort of limited space that is in our commons, right? And it's in a way the most contested space. And there are so many different things now competing for that space. You mentioned City Bike. There has to be a place for the docks. There has to be a place for electric vehicle charging, ambulance charging, infrastructure, utilities. There is so much happening that people don't necessarily think about because we all sort of take it for granted. But there is a sort of a very contentious and challenging fight for our common space. And I think a lot of the questions about how will innovation shape that differently, how will people's changes in kind of patterns and just generally what do people do is something that we're all sort of going through right now, and at least in some interim basis. Frankly, the idea of private use of public space is also one of these challenges. So I think a lot of work still needs to be done to sort of test things out, figure it out, allow for the pilot kind of approach. And that's something that obviously New York has been able to be, maybe not the vanguard, but certainly a leader in doing that work of really testing how we're going to sort of design the conflicts of our public spaces in a way that can serve more people and can maybe transition us away from things that haven't been as effective or equitable. So I think a lot of work that agencies are doing, and certainly from the private sector, there's probably a bigger push for some of this innovation. But I think we have to, really engage designers and a mix of disciplines of designers. Kate sort of mentioning like what are the different scales of landscape, right? We have to equally be asking those questions to see what other things and infrastructures we need for our city in terms of health, in terms of the ability to create environments that are healthy, sustainable in different ways. But it's an experiment. It's going to be live TV for a while.
Well, one of the issues that you point out in that chart and that I keep coming back to too, although I interpret it in a slightly different way, is all of those different agencies. And I think about it sometimes when I'm walking my dog because, one short dog walk will take you from the jurisdiction of the Department of Buildings to the Department of Sanitation to the Department of Transportation to, the MTA to like 3 other departments all just walking around the block. And, I think all of our experience is that a lot of times those agencies don't really talk to each other. They know where their borders, like one ends at the curb, and after that, that's somebody else's problem. So if you were tapped, let me just stick with Justin for a moment. If you were tapped as sort of, director of public everything in the next mayoral's administration, and the mayor said to you, look, how do we fix this? Mm-hmm. You stated the problem very eloquently. Can you help us figure out how you might take this enormous bureaucracy that you outlined and sort of get them to talk to each other so that we actually have a unified philosophy of public space?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure it out for years now. And, the anecdote that we often use in city government, like, oh, we should redesign the street for more pedestrians, more trees. And then the fire department says, if you don't give us 36 feet of right of way, a 6-year-old girl is going to die tomorrow and it'll be your fault, right? So these things really do happen. And I think a lot of the work of the reason I put that diagram kind of going the sideways instead of down is that we have to be willing to have more sideways conversations and decision making in government. And it's difficult, it's challenging, but we saw out of necessity a lot of that kind of thinking and work happen in this past year, both for the kind of the public health and economic reasons, but also people starting to actually think differently about things like social equity, who's involved, and I think we frankly have to use the difficulty and the stress as an excuse to operate kind of outside of some of those more traditional structures. And so that's why I kind of called it Department of Care. It's like you kind of start with the things that are almost mom and apple pie that you can't sort of have anybody say this is a bad idea to care for people or to care for my block or make a nice environment, right? And so kind of finding that agreement, you have to work at different levels, kind of in the bureaucracy, I say, to sort of convince those people just as much as, frankly, what happens in the political process, which are people kind of giving these big mandates and objectives, but not really doing it in a way that involves, the horizontal work that's really needed. And that's not just within government. That horizontal, care, it goes into our civic sector. It goes into our private sector, into our grassroots and community-based organizations. And that leveling, I think, is really the major shift that's needed for all the different participants to start doing that work in an authentic way.
Kate, I was pleased that you showed that slide of all of the highways kind of, weaving their way through parks and also surrounding where you actually live. And Shin-pei mentioned the highway in Syracuse that destroyed a neighborhood there. We all have examples of that. I was really struck by the fact that in his confirmation hearings, the designated Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, mentioned that idea of highways having a kind of racial justice or racial injustice history. He kind of left it there. I don't know what he was really implying about what he would actually do about that, except potentially invest more in public transit. But I'm wondering, especially since we've been, faced with this issue of the BQE, how do you see the role of those highways in the kind of green network that you were talking about? I mean, there is a movement in this country to demolish a lot of urban highways. Is that something we should be thinking about on a scale larger than, half a mile here or there?
It's an easy target, but absolutely. I mean, the DOT. I was also inspired by the Buttigieg testimony, because this is the first time you hear someone from transportation talking about climate or investment and urban life, even, rather than just saying like, okay, this pet project goes here, this pet project goes here, this highway goes here, and thinking about it sort of more holistically. And obviously it's an easy shot to take, but I see, Justin and Shin-pei know so well. Like I can imagine the most contested space right in Manhattan of like 14th Street and Broadway, or like just pick your street, and it's like each square inch is taken. But I see a huge potential in these wider arteries and throughout the boroughs, and whether that's a BQE or the Jackie Robinson and these other kind of spaces or roadways, it almost seems counterintuitive. Like if one were to just plan those today, right, and not thinking about retrofitting and how much this is going to cost, you would never just say, okay, I'm going to make a 60-foot wide road and I'm going to cut off northern Queens from Forest Park and the reservoir and so on, or I'm going to take the Van Wyck and I'm going to you would introduce at least sort of multi-purpose infrastructure, right? You would introduce either a high-speed bus lane, you would introduce a greenway. You would never design it like that. So I guess I feel like a little frustration, right? Because we have this massive spaghetti, highway spaghetti. It does seem to be the in-between that is the most, has the most potential. Even when we're talking about housing, and we have part of the BQE, not the one that you're referring to, I think, Justin, but there's a proposal to deck over parts of BQE. Rather than upzone these neighborhoods, couldn't you not develop housing, or couldn't you not sort of think about these highways as sort of places to add density? I don't know. I'm just sort of, to me, it's like it's definitely a soft spot in the urban landscape that we have put out of our mind, probably because it's not even on Justin's chart, right? It's maybe a state issue, but the fact is it moves through the physical landscape of our fair city, and for some reason it's still the sort of untouchable zone for safety, whereas there are many other arguments for a different framework around safety, which is sort of slowing down, changing up, enabling people to get out of cars, enabling kind of more and a sort of flexible or more redundant ways to get places, which is probably one of the keys for transportation. So I would just say, for me, like the two key zones on that chart are parks and DOT. And those two agencies coming together would be a huge boon for New York. But as we know, even within parks, there's like the division, the capital, and then there's maintenance, and then there's parks planning, and then So, but anyway, I'll just say that was when we started to look at the parks as these islands and what connected them. Literally, the only thing that connects them is a giant shoulder of the Jackie Robinson, but nevertheless, that exists. And it definitely seems like, I'll stop there, but it definitely seems like for me that is this next scale of connectivity and to me, justice, that in terms of linking up neighborhoods to resources and creating more of a fabric that supports people that we could sort of focus on.
Yeah. Justin mentioned just used the phrase privatization of public space, which can mean a lot of different things. Certainly, there have been complaints, for instance, with the restaurant streeteries occupying parts of the street that constitutes privatization of public space. Of course, the biggest chunk of it is on-street parking, right? Where people are, leave their private property there, often at no cost for long periods of time, and that takes up a huge amount of acreage. Shin-pei, I'm going to ask you, but really anybody can step in. This is a question from somebody in the audience. How many years before New York City eliminates free on-street parking and repurposes the space to more productive uses, or at least reaps revenue? And when in groups like this always comes up and everybody nods and everybody's in agreement. But realistically, is that just a utopian fantasy?
Good question. But I was thinking a lot about that. It's related to the highways. There's so many hidden subsidies. So there's all this demand, right? There's all this need to move around the city in all these different ways, like whether it's scooter, bike, what have you. But in these what the highways accommodate is like the only way we've sorted to meet a regional demand, which is through a car. And we haven't really experimented with other ways of providing that access. And there are ways of doing that now. I think that's maybe one area, and I'm not saying it needs to be ride hail, but there are microtransit. There's ways of making it easy for people to find services or implement services. And especially as we're moving out of COVID, I do think it's going to be a much more kind of distributed centers, or paracentral kind of region, where hopefully we get this bit of this like kind of invigoration of all the neighborhoods, all the little nodes across the region, and there are ways to connect them that aren't so reliant on kind of a hub and spoke model that's today. And so parking is obviously one of the biggest subsidies, right, that really props up driving and being able to drive. And it is a matter of political will. But I also think it's a matter of providing those other options. If you don't provide the other options, what are people, they don't view that as being given something, they view it as being taken away. And I do think there's an equity question here, which is quite challenging, which is affordable housing now is in areas where there is very little transit access. And even though owning a car is quite expensive, it's a huge burden for lower income households, it ends up being the only way they can reliably get somewhere. And if we don't provide those options, we have to think about, we have to provide those options, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying we shouldn't tackle the parking. I'm just saying we have to do much more on getting those options to people in order to start to chip away at parking.
So one of the ways of using those inequities to produce revenue to go into public transit to try to even out some of those inequities, has been congestion pricing, which, theoretically should be ever imminent, but so far hasn't kicked in, and we're not really sure when that's going to happen. But let me play devil's advocate here for a minute. If you are in one of these not transit-rich neighborhoods in Queens, and you're, go to work in Manhattan or to a denser part of Queens, or you got to cross into Brooklyn, and you could do it in 20 minutes in the car or an hour and a half on public transit. Or if you do have to go into Manhattan, like now, congestion pricing on top of tolls, on top of parking, it becomes a financial burden that's like considerably greater than somebody else's $2.75 to take the subway. Aren't there sort of, equity looks different, right? Depending on what your perspective is. For somebody like that, all of the things that might feel evening over the city as a whole, to that person really feels like a burden, right? Anybody want to take that?
It's a hard one, but I mean, the city actually did an amazing job winning that argument in demonstrating kind of the equitable distribution of the ways to the central business district and the kind of transportation improvements that would result from the additional revenue, and that it was completely dedicated to improving transit in these other areas. And I think that won public opinion. But I think these things it has to happen in a way simultaneously. And there's a bit of a transition period where, you start to kind of have that new experience of having congestion pricing, for example, and you haven't quite yet been able to put in place the alternatives, and that there could be a tension, and that requires a lot of trust on the part of the public for the agencies. But I think it has, that transition has to happen. It has to happen quickly. And I think thankfully there are services that are nimble. Our transit agencies have proven to be quite nimble in the midst of this crisis. And I think they can do this. They have way more tools today than they ever have had to try to provide service to more people and more a broader spectrum of needs.
So we have a question from somebody in the audience saying, do you all envision better ways for pedestrians and bicycles to coexist? But let me pull the camera out a little bit on that question, because I think what a lot of you are talking about are sort of a changing culture of how decisions get made, how equity gets calculated, how we think about getting around. And there's this huge chicken and egg issue, right? Can you change the culture before you've changed the mechanics? And how do you change the mechanics without changing the culture? So right now, the same person in the course of a day or a week may walk someplace, get on a bike to go someplace, and drive someplace. But at each stage, that person is in a hostile camp with the other two, right? We change hats, and all of a sudden, I'm a biker and I hate pedestrians, or vice versa, because they're getting in my way. So it's a big question, but we've seen a number of kind of mental shifts happening through this pandemic year. Do you guys have any magic wands to wave for how to shorten the time it takes to make some of these cultural changes happen, or is it just a matter of patience?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a matter of patience. I'm part of a group called Black Space that we look at sort of planning and design that's sort of challenging sometimes in Black communities, and we have one of our sort of sayings is "move at the speed of trust." And there's so much what we call repair work needed sometimes in these places and conversations where there is conflict, and there are many layers to maybe what's motivating people's decisions about certain issues, right? There could be a safety, like a bodily safety concern about conflict, getting hit by a bike or something like that. But there could be, if too many bikes with too many happy white people on it are coming through my neighborhood, I won't be here in 5 years. Safety, right? And we have to sort of acknowledge that what motivates a lot of people's thinking does have these different layers, and people have different needs and need to be understood. And unfortunately, usually that just takes time because there's work around communications that need to be done first. Then there are issues of kind of understanding that need to be reconciled, and almost after you've done those things, then you can even get to trust. But before you can really have an honest or a balanced conversation about people making sacrifices, right? So making choices is easy, making sacrifices is not. And so when we're doing that in a collective space, in a collective environment, you just need a lot of pre-work that needs to be done to get to that point, to get people to even be in that mindset. And something that is kind of important too is so much of our thinking around design planning is sort of the get the project done, the immediate, we're going to make a change, right? But we never talk about what we're keeping and what we're maintaining and what we're sustaining. And so much of the bandwidth, political, money, everything goes into kind of changing and that's why the Department of Care thing, right? Not sort of sustaining people. I think if people were cared for and sustained, there's a totally different possibility for asking for something to change or to give up. But we just do a terrible job at sustaining people's basic needs that it can be tough.
Yeah. Kate, and I think I'll give you the last word on this, because although it feels like we just got started, we're actually pushing 8 o'clock here. So I wanted to come back to this issue of scale, because you were talking, Justin started off with his pictures of these small bioswales, and you talked about the plaza in front of the Greenpoint Library and some of your, work mapping the whole city and your coastal resilience work. Do we have time to integrate all those different scales? And this is really a climate change conversation at the same time as we need to have the patience that Justin is talking about. Are those two things compatible?
Well, no, they are not. They are not compatible. And I personally, I feel like maybe I'm more of like a physical designer on this panel, and I kind of wanted to pick up on your chicken and egg question too, because I probably have false or overly rosy picture of potentially the role of design, rose-colored glasses. But I do feel like that there is much more of a reciprocity between the physical design of the urban landscape and a response. And without the trust, it's very difficult. But I think one can only imagine the kind of future patterns that might be imprinted in our collective memories, or in our collective kind of map of the city that are just not there, that we're assuming, these sort of borders and boundaries, and where some more kind of radical or connective kind of thinking could even stitch us more closely together. From a time scale standpoint, I mean, I just speak from experience for some of our coastal work that was a fast track project immediately after Superstorm Stanny, and is had multiple layers of federal, state, and local special convenings to get it through. We are going in construction next year, but it does. Even that process was a kind of a pilot, which is then now a case study for future projects. So I do feel like, and maybe going back to Justin's chart again, but our city has evolved relative to modernity, if you will, not to be too abstract, but it is a modern city, right? Where there's the water department is over here, and then parks is here, and then there's DOT and sanitation. And so, to our great credit as a fair city, we have really cracked the nut in terms of thinking about these systems. And so we find ourselves with systems that are functioning separately, and each are focused on meeting their core purpose, right? Delivering clean drinking water, picking up the garbage. And what is so difficult is to sort of take a pause and take a breath and say, what do we need to do now, and work backwards towards that problem. And so my own experience is that projects, that literal project scale, that forces the interaction and forces the meeting and forces the questions is a small, and frankly insufficient unit, but is at least a unit that essentially forces those crossing lines.
Because it's a matter of actually doing something and getting it done.
Yes, yeah. You can't just have a meeting. We all, right. You have to focus and then make choices, or and try to mobilize around what can be done. And right. So I think we do need, as a city, to start to really reckon with some of these challenges.
I want to just close with a comment about some of trying to pull a little bit the things that you've been saying together, which is that it's very difficult in the kind of bureaucratic regime that you're talking about for cities to be out front identifying and then solving problems. They're not really geared to doing that on a day-to-day basis, as we're seeing, for instance, with the whole vaccination campaign. That's a separate topic. But it's interesting to me that, for instance, Uber saw one opening, these scooter companies saw another, Amazon is using the curb for delivery, and that's a public good, right? A public acreage, public realm, which they have basically co-opted as their staging areas for delivering a private service. And the government is always kind of playing catch up with that and doing it slowly. And it seems to me that one of the challenges of obtaining a city that is both fair in the sense of beautiful and fair in the sense of just is for government to do a better job of catching up to where private enterprise is. So for instance, saying, okay, Amazon and all of these other companies, you want to use our curb? Let's figure out how to allocate that space, and let's develop the technology and the mindset to do it. And even just in the public realm, identifying problems that all of us experience every day and that are not that hard to fix become bureaucratically insuperable. And the example that I think of every single day is, why are we piling garbage bags on the sidewalk, making it impossible for pedestrians, never mind strollers or wheelchairs, to get by? This is a fixable problem. This doesn't even require negotiations with a private enterprise. It's simply something that other cities have managed to do, and we can't. And it's not as if we have to reinvent the wheel. It's that, and this is really sort of a way of urging the next generation of leadership in this city to figure some of these things out and to take on the administrative burdens before they take on the political ones. Because I feel like we are sometimes mixing up ideological and simply logistical issues. And I think the vaccination program is another good example of that, where in trying to promote equity, we wind up doing exactly the opposite, because we can't do anything until like everything has been, determined to be, to check all the boxes. And so we wind up keeping an inequitable system simply out of inertia. I would love to throw that back at all of you and stay another hour and sort of have you deconstruct what I just said in your spheres, but I've been told that, we have a hard stop as of 5 minutes ago. So I'm going to say thank you to everybody who joined us, to everybody who's going to be watching this on the Museum of the City of New York's Facebook page over the coming days. I know we get many hundreds of views after it's all over, and especially to the museum, to Curb for co-sponsoring it, and to our panelists for such an engaging conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks. And just a quick thank you from the Museum of the City of New York to Justin, Shin-pei, and Kate for joining us tonight and for such an excellent discussion. And Justin Davidson, to you for helming this wonderful series about what might be possible. You said, if you could be the commissioner of public everything, how about you and Shin-pei and Kate and Justin all do that together? I nominate you.
We'll divide it all up.
Because this is your ideas are just fantastic. So thanks everyone for joining us. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.